Before I get into the subject of this video, I'd like to remind people that on the 34th day of the war on Gaza, Israel killed almost 11,000 innocent Palestinians, including 4,412 children, 2,918 women, and 667 elderly people. 27,000 are injured, mostly with life-changing injuries. There are 2,650 people missing, and over 1,400 of these are children, mostly under the rubble, due to Israeli bombings. Over 50% of Gaza's houses are uninhabitable. There are over 1.5 million internal refugees, which make up 70% of the population already formed of refugees from 1948 to 1967. No electricity, no water, hardly any food. All of this is being committed with full US and Western government backing, and the world is watching genocide and crimes against humanity being committed in front of everyone. People standing up against this are being intimidated, labeled, and censored. These crimes are not a one-off, but have been repeatedly committed by Zionists since the establishment of Israel. We Palestinians know this very well, whereas many people are just starting to understand this, purely from the high level of evil crimes and official complicity. More importantly, these crimes are ongoing and can be repeated at any point as long as the system allowing them to happen remains intact. Humanity as a whole has a moral obligation to change everything that allows this to happen against anyone in the world, and not just the Palestinian people. Whether it's politicians, governments, corporations, systems, or the whole international order. What's happening in Gaza is a call for action not only to end the apartheid against the Palestinian people, but to end its enablement, which is far more dangerous to protect future generations and humanity as a whole. Going back to the subject. It's fascinating how a comedian makes more sense talking about Gaza than the entire political elite in the West. Bassem Youssef did the Palestinian cause more justice than any other political figure in the last month with his online interviews that went viral. But he fell short when it came to labeling the Palestinians. I repeatedly mention, and this is a very important subject, that it's the Palestinians who are being labeled and not just a group of them, namely Hamas. Once you label one side, what you're practically doing is delegitimize them and everything they do, contrary to the moral position any decent human being should be taking, which is siding with the oppressed and supporting their struggle against enslavement, respecting people and their right to self-determination. With the Palestinians, Hamas is indeed a proscribed organization, but only in 34 countries. Israel, the US, the UK, EU states, Canada, Australia, Japan, and Paraguay. These countries happen to be Israel's closest allies that proscribed it as such upon Israel's request. The most significant of these countries in terms of importance and support for Israel happen to be colonial, imperial powers with a long history of occupation, mass murder, and enslavement. However, this isn't the case with the majority of the world. 161 countries that make up 83% of the world happen to not agree with this description. Many of them know what the Palestinians face because they suffered from the same things. In fact, the unprecedented solidarity and protests in the West, despite government fear-mongering and intimidation, signals public distrust in the official narrative altogether. People went out in their millions and still are, although they're being told that what they're doing is anti-Semitic, hateful, and even disrespectful. The reason I said labeling the Palestinians rather than restrict it to Hamas is because it is directed at the Palestinian side as a whole, the oppressed, the occupied side. Hamas is being used as a front, a scapegoat to hide this and delegitimize their actions resisting the heinous crimes of Zionism, to cover up the fact that we're talking about people that have been suffering for over 75 years. This labeling also undermines the Palestinian people for electing Hamas, similar to the undermining of many people in other countries for choosing political parties that want independence and reject foreign occupation, dictatorship, and hegemony. Aside from a military wing, Hamas also runs civil services in Gaza that are completely not related to their military wing. And because they labeled them, they question everything that comes out of them, like the number of casualties, losses, damage, or anything else the Palestinians say. After all, Hamas runs them in Gaza. Piers Morgan and his likes in the mainstream media use this to cast doubt on the number of people killed in Israel's genocide by saying, well, Hamas said that. They also disregard basic facts when they talk. Whether the misinformation about Al-Aqsa flood operation, when it comes to deliberate targeting of civilians or babies, disregarding multiple Israeli hostage statements that contradict this, or lies like Hamas's aim is to kill all Jews, which was never their aim. In fact, in their updated 2017 charter, they make it clear and they distinguish between Judaism and Zionism, like many people do, like many Jewish people do, and clearly state that they fight oppressive, aggressive, occupying Zionism. Clause 16 of their charter states, Hamas asserts that the conflict with the Zionist project is not a conflict with the Jews because of their religion. Hamas is not waging a struggle against the Jews because they are Jews, but rather is waging a struggle against the aggressors, the occupying Zionists, while the occupation leaders are the ones who are using the slogans of Jews and Judaism in the conflict to describe their usurping entity with them. Section 17 continues, Hamas rejects the persecution of any person or the abridgment of his rights on national, religious, or sectarian basis, and believes that anti-Semitism and the persecution of Jews are phenomena that are essentially linked to European history and not the history of Arabs and Muslims or their inheritances. The Zionist movement, which was able to occupy Palestine under the auspices of Western powers, is the most dangerous example of settler occupation, which has been removed from most parts of the world and which must be removed from Palestine. Despite this, we're repeatedly lied to by mainstream media claiming the contrary to approve the genocide happening in front of our eyes by Israel. The mass killing and ethnic cleansing of people based on their identity. This is a very dirty, malicious trick used as an attempt to legitimize the criminals and whitewash their crimes. After all, how could anyone even consider supporting them without such manipulation? How can anyone support a state that was established on religious and ethnic supremacy, committed mass genocides and expulsions, and constantly violates human rights and international law? This position is what Zionism wants you to adopt. Ironically, Zionism is a violent, extremist political ideology that uses and abuses the Jewish religion to establish justification for its entire existence. Yet it has a state that is being supported in full by the US and many Western governments, despite its undeniable crimes against humanity. Politicians in the West openly identify as Zionists. Have you noticed how no one asks an Israeli guest if they consider the IDF to be a terrorist army or if Israel is a terrorist state? No one asks them to condemn themselves, although this is what they actually are and have always been. They are the occupying, oppressing force and killed 200 times more Palestinians than Hamas and all other Palestinian groups combined since 1948. In fact, Palestinian resistance movements were established as a response to Israeli aggression and occupation. Yet condemning the Palestinian side and actions is a core starting point to mainstream media. It must be. They do this deliberately to put anyone supporting Palestine in defense mode rather than the natural attack mode where they should be, resisting the manipulated mainstream media narrative and attacking, naming and shaming anybody that supports a racist, violent, oppressive occupation. The people defending Palestine or any just causes for the oppressed people around the world for that matter shouldn't fall for this trap. The people of many Latin American, Middle Eastern and East Asian countries faced this type of labeling whenever they resisted violent occupiers. American citizens were imprisoned for resisting the heinous war in Vietnam that killed millions of innocent people for American corporate greed. Labeling is a malicious tool selectively used by imperial powers to demonize people, groups, or organizations that challenge and resist their unjust, unfair hegemony attempts across the world that is mostly accomplished by the use of force, violence, and intimidation. Actual terrorism. They want you to be on the back foot, scare you with labeling, and put you in a weak position. The response in such cases should be non-compliance with the propaganda, resisting the violent occupation, and reminding everyone that they are talking about people under violent apartheid occupation. What we need to do is end the root cause of the problem, condemn the disease and not the symptoms that it causes. How can any decent human being blame a group of people suffering from constant, violent, oppressive occupation for resisting it? Basic human decency and integrity compels us to stand with any oppressed group in the world, regardless of their race, religion, or ideological background. It's about our humanity that they're trying to strip away from us, a humanity that they clearly do not possess. Sky News, the BBC, Piers and their likes are actors with scripts that must be repeated when it comes to this conflict. Statements such as, Israel has a right to defend itself, Hamas are terrorists, or questions like, do you condemn their actions? These are premeditated sentences deliberately used and repeated no matter how wrong or out of context they are. Why should a racist, violent occupation have a right to exist, let alone defend itself? The right of self-defense in such a case is exclusive to the oppressed, who should be supported. This is a desperate psychological warfare attempt that the Zionist war machine engages in to try and sell its lies to the world, but there's a limit to people's blindness. So, why is the oppressed side being labeled? Well, it's simply to make them defenseless. By labeling the strongest organization for those under occupation, you're basically saying that they do not have a right to fight back and liberate themselves from an oppressive occupation, not even fight a ground invasion. Think for a second. What the Palestinians are doing to prevent IOF aggression against them in Gaza is labeled as terrorism. This is outrageous, malicious, inhumane, and absurd. This is like labeling you if you fight back an armed thief storming your house, trying to kill you and your family and steal everything. Who does this benefit? The thief, of course.